I'm here representing Dean Miles, who is in Aspen working on an ABA committee, and she asked me to welcome you on her behalf, which I'm most pleased to do. I just noticed, Stephen and I were just talking, and realized this is the 20th year of this lecture series. I was the fourth presenter and was most pleased to have received this recognition by the Guild of Catholic Lawyers. And for many of us who have given this lecture, it actually provided an incentive to dig more deeply into what our Catholic tradition and heritage adds to the areas of law, whatever our particular field might be. So it was rewarding, it was an honor, and Professor Mary Leary is continuing in that tradition and is a most deserving recipient of this award today. I'll tell you, I was vice provost of the university and across the street at McMahon Hall for about 5 years, came back last year, and one of the things I discovered when I came back is that I hope it had nothing to do with me being gone, but the hiring of faculty that has taken place over the past several years has been truly extraordinary, and there is an immensely talented group of younger, newer members of the faculty, Mary Leary being certainly one of them. Delightful individuals, good scholars, outstanding teachers. It's really a pleasure to have come back here. Mary, as one of our newer members of the faculty, is being recognized today and will be giving us a lecture on a topic which is challenging, I'm sure, to talk about, and that we'll all find very interesting. My job is simply to welcome you, which I've done for the dean and for myself and for the faculty as a whole. Then I'm going to turn it over to the president of the John Paul II Guild of Catholic Lawyers, Stephen Brownback, who will first give the award to Mary for giving this talk, and then introduce Mary, who will deliver the lecture this year. Thank you all for being here, and it should be a productive afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to the presentation of the 2009 Mary Mirror of Justice Award. As Dean Garvey mentioned, this is an annual award presented to a member of the faculty in recognition of their outstanding contribution to scholarship and to their commitment of teaching the law in order to achieve justice through the law. Past recipients have included Dean Miles, Dean Garvey, Professor Selecchia, Professor Brieger, and many others who are here in this room right now. But before we can present the award, I think it's important to heed some of Professor Leary's advice to all of her students, something that none of us would ever forget, and that is that facts matter. Professor Leary came here to Catholic with a bachelor's degree and a law degree from that other Catholic university down the road, Georgetown University. She came here with experience as an assistant U.S. attorney, as the deputy director of the Office of Legal Counsel for at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as a former director of the National Center for the Prosecution of Child Abuse, and just a very talented resume. But since she's been here, she has really exemplified the sort of service that this award recognizes. You know, as a Catholic law school, we have many different communities that we serve. Certainly one of them is the Catholic community. And in this context, Professor Leary led the official delegation of the Holy See to the Third World Congress Against Sexual Exploitation of Children and Adolescents, which took place in Rio de Janeiro. She also spoke at a conference celebrating the 20th anniversary of Mulieris Dignitatum, which was Pope John Paul II's reflection on the dignity and vocation of women. As a law school, we also are part of the legal community, and here she has certainly shined. She has published numerous articles, including Kennedy v. Louisiana, a chapter of subtle changes in the Supreme Court's book on the death penalty, which was published in the Federal Sentencing Reporter. She has published articles on child pornography in the University of Virginia Journal of Social Policy and the Law, as well as on pornography and the dignity of the soul in a forthcoming issue of the Ave Maria Law Review. She has presented at conferences around the world, including India on the subject of computer-assisted crimes against children, and the University of Virginia on the subject of child pornography. Finally, and most importantly, she's a member of the law school community here, of students and faculty, and she has counseled countless numbers of worried 1Ls through her 1L crim law course. She's set many of us straight, helped us to keep perspective on grades, on jobs, on how we should go about approaching the law. She served as the spill auctioneer, bringing in tens of thousands of dollars to help with the public interest law program, and she was recognized as the 2009 Teacher of the Year. For all of these reasons, it's a great pleasure and a great privilege to recognize Professor Leary with the 2009 Mary Mirror of Justice Award.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's nice to receive such a nice introduction from a former student, and it's nice to be on the list of the kind of faculty members that you mentioned, Jean Garvey, Professor Fishman, Lucia, so many others. I want to thank, of course, the Guild of Catholic Lawyers for the invitation to speak today. It's always a pleasure, I think, to come together as a community and talk about issues of faith and justice. And for me, it's a reminder, quite honestly, of why I'm here, about how what we do here at Catholic University is bigger than just preparing for passing the bar, or a life of billable hours, or a life of winning. But rather, I like to think that here we try to examine more fundamental questions of who we are and who we want to be. As Stephen mentioned, the command of the Mary Mirror of Justice Award lecture is to bring into discussion and reflection a matter that involves the pursuit of justice and peace, and in doing so to incorporate elements of one's faith, in my case, Catholic faith, or Catholic social teaching. As Stephen mentioned, as a lawyer back in the day in the courtroom, when I was handling cases involving sexual assault, I found myself during my closing arguments on a case-by-case basis often reminding the juries of Senator Humphrey's last speech before the United States Senate, where he reminded us that the moral test of a society is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life. And I felt then, as I feel now as an academic, exploring how we're doing on that moral test, that victims of the sex industry are deep in the shadows of life. And in my scholarship, as I try to explore these issues beyond a sort of case-by-case basis, I'm left wondering, gosh, how are we doing there? Are we our sister's keeper, or are we just willing to let her be a kept sister? Hence the title of my discussion. Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. That's an awfully big statement, I think. It's not my statement. It's a statement that has been made by countless others. Presidents of the United States, the Department of Justice, the United States Congress, Caritas International, the United Nations, just to name a few. It's my goal today to hopefully spend some time examining the implications of that statement regarding commercial sex trafficking, the largest portion of human trafficking. And in that examination, I'm hoping to suggest that Winston Churchill's warning may come to fruition, that those who fail to learn from history are bound to repeat it. Hence, I'm going to put forward a framework where we look at this issue of commercial sex trafficking from both the perspective of our past, our present, and of our future, and the hopes that it'll help us lead us out of our present. Now, why do I want to lead us out of our present? Well, here are some numbers. The United Nations reports that approximately 27 million people worldwide today, as we're sitting here, are held in some form of slavery, forced prostitution, or bonded labor. The State Department and the United States Congress estimate that approximately 700,000 people are trafficked annually, primarily women and children, up to 80% who are trafficked for the purposes of the sex trade. Domestically, the State Department estimates, and they concede that this is probably an underestimation, that 14,000 to 17,000 foreign nationals are trafficked into the United States annually. And tonight, as we go to sleep here in our nation's capital, we will also be going to sleep in one of the top 10 destination cities for human trafficking in the country. And as we go to lay our heads on our pillows, it's estimated that 280,000 homeless, runaway, and throwaway children will be at risk for commercial sex exploitation. That is our present. And let's be clear what I'm talking about when I talk about commercial sex trafficking. For purposes of this talk, I'm just going to focus on that narrow subset of human trafficking. And primarily, I'm going to be talking about women and children. To be clear, I want to acknowledge that, of course, there are male victims of commercial sex trafficking. But for the overwhelming majority are female, so you'll hear me use that pronoun. Commercial sex trafficking is one form of what's referred to as severe sex trafficking under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. This is the most comprehensive federal legislation in the United States addressing that issue, and I'll be primarily referring to that statute today. Commercial sex trafficking, it's kind of a misnomer. Under the law, it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act. It is one of the forms of severe human sex trafficking when the victim is either a minor or force, fraud, or coercion are used. Noticeably absent from that definition is any sort of requirement for transnational transportation or even transportation at all from across state lines. And I'm focusing on commercial sex trafficking for a number of reasons, to be frank, time being one of them, of course, but also because it highlights for us how that statement, human trafficking is modern-day slavery, it highlights for us in acute ways the challenges of that statement. I mean, presumably we all accept slavery is bad, right? Hopefully. Human trafficking, bad. That sounds really bad and immoral and wrong. Well, under the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, if one is a minor and commits a commercial sex act, or one is induced by force, fraud, or coercion to do so, under the law, one is no longer labeled a prostitute. One is a victim of commercial sex trafficking. In other words, if the statement is correct, one is a slave in our midst. Hence the challenge for us. Are we really ready to say human trafficking is modern-day slavery? Are we prepared to accept and practice and become and respond this as our sister's keeper? Or will she remain a kept sister, somebody else's problem? And I would suggest that the answer, or at least some guidance on that question, lies in an analogy to our own historical institution of slavery. Let me explain what I mean by that, by looking in the past. Let me do that by way of telling you a story. Several years ago, a friend of mine found himself being able to travel to South Africa. And he decided on that trip to take his oldest son. His name is Kevin. His name was Daniel, and he asked Daniel to come along in the hopes that it would be the first opportunity to expose Daniel to, some of the not-so-great parts of the world and to some of the more human tragedies. And Daniel was your typical 11, 12-year-old boy, played football, not terribly emotional, rough-and-tumble kid. And when they were in Soweto on a bus tour, Kevin, his father, looked over at him, looking out the window, and he saw that Daniel was weeping. Of course, Kevin was a little bit disarmed and said, "Daniel, son, what's the matter? Why are you crying?" And Daniel looked up at his father and he said, "I just can't believe people would treat people like this. I just can't believe people would treat people like this." What a simple yet elegant statement as he was referring to apartheid, but as to so many of these institutions. And that is really the question. I know for myself, when I look back at our own American history, I think to myself, how did people ever think that that was okay? I mean, how did you ever think it was okay to buy and sell another person? Surely they just weren't as enlightened as we are now. Or maybe they didn't get the kind of Catholic social teaching or any social teaching on this issue. Surely they are just worse than me. right? And that's an easy analysis for our past. It gets a little bit more difficult, I think, when we have to ask ourselves the same questions today. And can we see if and try to figure out if we can see if we are on the right path or if we're doomed to repeat our own history. So I'm going to propose we spend the next few minutes or so, depending upon how fast I talk, focusing on three actors, both in the past and in the present. Parallel actors, I would like to suggest: the slave trader and the trafficker, the slave owner and the sex purchaser, also known as a John, and the bystander of our past and the bystander of our present. Now, noticeably absent here are a number of other important actors in both these institutions, and I'm not trying to minimize them. But for our purposes and for the purpose of time, I'm going to limit my comments to these actors in the context of what we call pimp-controlled prostitution, which constitutes nearly all forms of prostitution. Okay, so let's turn first to the parallel of the slave trader of the 19th century and the trafficker and the pimp. And let me acknowledge right now that the analogy between slavery in our history and human trafficking is not a perfect one, to be sure. Indeed, there are differences and distinct harms to African Americans, to African Americans as a people, taken in chains from their own continent here to be enslaved for hundreds of years, and after that period to be the victims of gross civil rights violations in a systematic way. I'm in no way trying to minimize that. Again, the analogy isn't even mine. But I think that there are some parallels, and it is to those parallels to which I would like to turn my attention, because I think they can help us in our present. And make no mistake about it, prostitution is an institution, like slavery. While it varies from region to region in the United States, researchers note that it encompasses street prostitution, escort services, massage parlors, brothels, hotels, rented houses and apartments, front businesses and migrant worker camps, and rent-by-the-hour motels, just to name a few. The connections to organized crime are inescapable. In fact, the UN reports that it is the third most profitable form of criminal activity behind only guns and drugs. It raises billions of dollars annually. Let's look back at our history. What drove slavery? Well, I don't claim to be a historian, nor do I play one on TV, but there goes my goal to not tell one joke during this entire lecture. There it was, okay? Slavery, of course, began in the New World by enslaving the Indians when they arrived. Poor treatment and disease quickly eradicated that population. So what happened? Well, of course, then the Europeans turned to the continent of Africa and imported slaves solely for the purpose of cheap labor. By the mid-1500s to 1800s, almost 9 million slaves were shipped from Africa to the Americas, with about 5% coming to the United States, or to the colonies and then the United States. The supply side of slavery was clearly a vulnerable and captured people. The demand side were Americans who wished to purchase people to meet their own perceived needs. So slavery was clearly economically driven. And so is human trafficking. As noted in the recent work, The Slave Next Door, so-called source countries or regions today in human trafficking are characterized by, guess what? Poverty, unemployment, war, political and economic instability. The vast majority of slaves come from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, the poorest parts of those countries, where traffickers, quote, can easily deceive desperate victims and their parents into believing that they're being offered a better life. Economic disproportion, disadvantage, lack of sustainable income, poverty are all preyed upon by recruiters, traffickers, and pimps. And domestic trafficking is no different. Dr. Lionholt, in Making the Harm Visible, documents that most women in prostitution are vulnerable because they have previously endured abuse either as children from sexually abusive adults or they've been subject to violent or abusive husbands or boyfriends. Quote, recruitment can take many forms, including kidnapping, solicitation, others recruiting on behalf of the trafficker, or appearing genuinely interested in a romantic relationship to gradually coerce a victim into prostitution. And make no mistake about it, women and girls are recruited at malls by befriending and creating emotional and drug and alcohol dependencies to entrap them. They become highly profitable for traffickers because, unlike other contraband, their uses are not finite. In addition to similar economic motives and benefits, the method of controlling slaves in our history are similar to the method of controlling victims of human trafficking. Dr. Raymond and Dr. Hughes' 2001 study of prostitution in the United States described the control mechanisms as, quote, extreme violence and slavery-like practices. Indeed, Lisa Thompson, the director of the Sexual Initiative Against, the Initiative Against Sexual Trafficking, in her 2005 testimony before the House Finance Committee, coined the term sexual gulag to describe, quote, a global system made up of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of brothels, bars, strip clubs, massage parlors, escort services, and street corners where people are sold for sex. The sexual gulag entraps and exploits women and children, turning them into sexual commodities. And she goes on to point out that one difference between the sexual gulag and the Soviet gulag is, of course, the Soviet gulag was secret, but the sexual gulag occurs out in the public. And regarding pimp methods of control, Schwartz, Williams, and Farley, and Melissa Farley's profound study of prostitution in Nevada writes as follows. Systematically and according to well-known methods, pimps psychologically traumatize women in order to establish psychological, biological, social, and economic control over the lives of the women they sell through the use of chronic terror, cunning use of various aspects of captivity, isolation from others, starvation, sleep deprivation, unexpected sexual violence, and learned helplessness. Now let me say a word about, let me spend a minute on the word pimp. Okay, I understand that word is loaded with a lot of stereotypes, a figure seemingly not fit into any industry. But make no mistake about it, pimping is sex trafficking. Under the United States law, if you harbor, transport, provide, or obtain a person to engage in a commercial sex act, the acts of a pimp, you are a human trafficker. So the terms can be interchangeable. Of course, one can just be a trafficker and not a pimp, but a pimp is by definition a trafficker. So you'll hear me use that term. But the stereotype image we have, don't be deceived what's on television and in the movies. Pimps come in all disguises of the sex trade. As, again, with Dr. Raymond and Hughes' work about the United States system, their work indicates that they are controllers and operators of the sex industry vary. Some sex businesses are family-owned, and others are owned or backed by prominent local community members, including, and get this, judges and lawyers. Others are controlled or financed by organized crime groups. Law enforcement estimates that up to 76% of sex enterprises are controlled, financed, or backed by organized crime. Again, trafficking is much more lucrative than smuggling contraband items because human slaves can provide a source of long-term income through prostitution. Organized crime plays a key role in this business. Okay, so let's assume my analogy works between the sex trader and the trafficker. Then we turn to the social teachings available to both of them at the time. How is it, again, that someone could trade in people and not feel morally challenged? One obvious answer is that maybe those slave traders failed to understand the teachings that were available at the time. The basic teaching of the Catholic Church for centuries that the dignity of a human being. Phrased in another way, they didn't see that the people they were dealing with were indeed people. Okay, this is, of course, most clearly reflected in the Constitution, where, of course, the African-American male was once 3/5 of a person, the African-American female, and for that matter, all females, was not a person at all. Now, to be sure, let me be clear, as a matter of natural law, one shouldn't need a specific teaching on slavery to know that it is wrong to buy and sell human beings. And I'm not suggesting that a lack of a specific social teaching is any form of a defense, to be clear. But I do think that an examination of the teachings available to those in our past, who we so easily judge, or I should say who I so easily judge, merits a comparison to what the teachings are that we have today. And of course, I'm focusing on what the church has said specifically regarding slavery, the sex trade, and prostitution. And to be clear, I am not discussing church practices. Indeed, the Roman Catholic Church's hierarchy and institution in the United States has far from clean hands on the matters of slavery, segregation, and discrimination. Often, however, there is a chasm between the ideal espoused, searched for, and the practice, and it's to the ideal that I wish to turn. Joel Panzer, there's much dispute about what the social teachings were as to the Catholic Church back in the 19th century. Joel Panzer, however, in his 2007 study of the question, The Popes and Slavery, disputes the account offered by other historians, and he refers to many papal documents which discuss the issue of unjust slavery over several centuries. And he offers a convincing argument that in terms of the Pope and the Magisterium, the teaching was to consistently condemn slavery. Time does not permit me to go through all the documents, so why don't I just mention the first, the earliest, and the most recent as it relates to the 19th century. The earliest was in 1435, 60 years before Columbus set sail to the Americas. Eugene IV's papal bull Sicut Dudem, condemning the enslavement, in this case, of native peoples in the Canary Islands, and ordering its termination. After documenting the atrocities, this is what he said, in case there's any question. We exhort among the Christian faithful that they themselves desist from these aforementioned deeds and restrain them rigorously. And no less do we order and command all and each of the faithful to restore to their pristine liberty all and each person who were once the residents of the Canary Islands, it's the subject people we're talking about, and who have been made subject to slavery. These people are to be totally and perpetually free and are to be let go without exaction of reception of any money. This type of language, and let me be clear, the accompanying punishment for failure to follow this was excommunication, is continued throughout several centuries. And the last piece in the time period we're interested in 1839, Pope Gregory XVI now clearly states in his encyclical Apostolos in Supremo that the ownership of slaves hurts the dignity of both the slave and the owner, and it's dangerous. He follows up by blatantly saying, we, by apostolic authority, warn and strongly exhort that no one in the future dare bother unjustly, despoil of their possessions, or reduce to slavery Indians, blacks, or other such peoples. And while Panzer or the other historians, who is correct sort of in how clear or how communicated the social teaching was made, the result is everyone is in agreement, primarily non-adherence. Okay. That sounds like some social teaching. How about on human trafficking today? Do we get some similar social teaching? Maybe it can be that pimps just don't get that kind of social teaching. And let me be clear: when I talk about pimps, we can referring to either men or women. I'll probably use the male pronoun, but note that the UN's most recent report on trafficking documented more women have been convicted of trafficking crimes internationally than men. But there are lots of reasons probably for that. Okay, well, unlike the 19th century slave trader owner, there's no question as to the teachings of the church on human trafficking. Indeed, the church has been quite direct. John Paul II writes in Mulieris Dignitatem in 1998 that every person is made in the image and likeness of God, and that is the foundation of the church's teachings in this area. Specifically on the topic of human trafficking, John Paul II's 2002 letter to the human rights dimension of trafficking states as follows. The trade in human persons constitutes a shocking offense against human dignity and a grave violation of human rights. It is an affront to fundamental human values that are shared by all cultures and peoples, values rooted in the very nature of the human person. This thinking is followed up by the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and the Mexican bishops in their document from 2002, Together on a Journey of Hope. Trafficking in persons, in which men, women, and children from all over the globe are transported to other countries for the purpose of forced prostitution, inherently rejects the dignity of the human person and exploits conditions of global poverty. And finally, our current Pope, Benedict XVI, has specifically focused on the traffickers' recruitment techniques, as well as the vulnerability of those trafficked. In his 2006 statement, and he actually has many statements on this topic, this is the one I selected. Trafficking in human beings, he writes, is a scourge. It becomes easy for the trafficker to offer his services to the victims who often do not even vaguely suspect what awaits them. In some cases, these are women and girls who are destined to be exploited almost like slaves in their work, and not infrequently in the sex industry too. So in trying to comprehend our present and our past, I think we see some distinct differences. Well, we easily condemn, again, the slave traders and owners of the past for failing to see the dignity of people. And again, to be sure, one shouldn't need a specific social teaching in this area. I offer the observation that by way of comparison, in our present day, we have ample teaching on this topic. We have universal condemnation by government, civil society, and the United Nations. And yet the world in which we live is not limited to 9 million, but rather we have, as I indicated, 27 million, people living in slave-like conditions. Over 1 million children in the sex trade, with the average age of entry 12 to 13 years of age. So our initial judgment on the failure of the Enlightenment of the past may possibly be even more condemning for our present. Well, let's try another analogy. How about the slave owner and the purchaser of sex, or the John? Okay? I suggest this is a parallel to the slave owner because they're engaged in the same activity. The slave owner, with obvious differences, the slave owner, who justifies by several rationales, paid money to buy other people based on their race for his own purposes. His buying power was absolute, and his purchase enabled him to use the slave how he saw fit, and he owned every aspect of him or her as well as the offspring. The John, which is a euphemism for purchaser of sex, in case there's any confusion there, but yet the use of that label speaks so much to how we address this issue. As described by Donna Hughes in her 2009 work, A Perpetrator-Focused Approach, although they are not stigmatized, meaning Johns, in the same way prostitutes are, they are the ultimate consumers of trafficked women and children. They use them for entertainment and sex and often perpetrate violence against them. Such a person, I would submit the analogy, works because they buy another human being, although for a limited time frame, to use as they will to meet their purposes. And just like with the concept of slavery, the sex purchaser has the expectation that his money allows him to use the person how he demands for the time that he is purchased. They also conjure up justifications. They claim that, in fact, they're helping these women, that they, after all, paid for this use, if you will, not recognizing or not acknowledging that most of these women never see any of this money and only temporarily hold on to it until they hand it over to their pimp or trafficker. It comes with the idea, though similar to the slave owner, that their money allows every demand to be met. And when these women take steps to protect their own health and safety, they are met with violence. Which brings me to the second part of the analogy. This is not only an analogy in some of the activity, but also in the treatment. Again, Drs. Raymond and Hughes note, and I quote, "Large numbers of women in the sex industry live in a state of constant trauma, vigilance, and expectation of violence. Violence, rape, robbery, and killings are normal occurrences for women in prostitution. However, violence does not only come from pimps and traffickers, but also from the buyers." Okay. How about our Catholic social teaching? Maybe it only aims at the traffickers, and maybe we haven't heard anything about these buyers of sex or buyers of women. Well, no. Much focus has been paid in our social teaching on the demand for what we are now seeing called a perpetrator-focused approach. The teaching has many components, and it's really exemplified in John Paul II's 1995 letter to women. This is a long quote, but I couldn't cut much from this Pope on this quote, okay? How can we not mention the long and degrading history, although often an underground history, of violence against women in the area of sexuality? We cannot remain indifferent and resigned before this phenomenon. The time has come to condemn vigorously the types of sexual violence which frequently have women for their object, and to pass laws which effectively defend them from such violence. Nor can we fail, in the name of respect due the human person, to condemn the widespread hedonistic and commercial culture which encourages the systemic exploitation of sexuality and corrupts even very young girls' bodies to be used for profit. John Paul II continues to write in these terms, always basing his reflections on the fundamental dignity of the human being, a theme that's developed more fully in his 1998 Mulieris Dignitatem. In 2002, and again, his letter to the Human Rights Dimension Conference, he expands his focus on the perpetrator, saying as follows: "Attention needs to be paid to the causes of the increased demand which fuels the market for human slavery and tolerates the human cost which results. A sound approach to issues involved will lead to an examination of the lifestyles and models of behavior, particularly with regard to the images of women which generate what has become a veritable industry of sexual exploitation in developed countries. And here I would submit that we see through John Paul's writings three significant themes in the church's teaching. A specific condemnation of the demand side of the market and those who allow the supply side to exist. Secondly, he identifies a cause not only of poverty, but on the promotion of an image of women which fuels the perception that they, like slaves, are a commodity to be purchased and not people. And lastly, he recognizes that this is an industry with a powerful ability to profit from the trade. A final component of the church's teachings, which I've always found somewhat surprising, but I think consistent, is the church's teaching regarding purchasers of sex and the damage that they are doing to themselves. This is most clearly reflected in Mulieris Dignitatem, where John Paul writes, "Whenever a man is responsible for offending a woman's personal dignity and vocation, he acts contrary to his own personal dignity and his own vocation. He acts contrary to the God within." Last group of actors, the bystanders in the 19th century, the bystanders today. Certainly, many in the 19th century saw that slavery was wrong, and there were great Americans like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who were active in their opposition. And more importantly, at least to my point, there were certainly many ordinary citizens who exercised extreme bravery in their opposition, either publicly or subversively, to this institution. Okay? However, many people not directly involved in slavery, the bystanders, if you will, did nothing. And indeed, while Panzer and other historians disagree as to the clarity of the magisterium's teaching, all agree that the laity and the clergy did not respond consistent with the concept of human dignity. These non-abolitionist bystanders in the slavery era fell into several categories. First, there were those that profited indirectly from the institution, such as textile mills, and subsequent to the invention of the cotton gin, the demand for cheap cotton really revived the whole slavery industry. Second, there were those that regarded it, and this should sound familiar, as not really their problem. That's reserved for another part of the country. That's reserved for other people, another race, not my problem. Indeed, if the post-Civil War demonstrated quite clearly a continued treatment of the African American as the other, even after the 13th Amendment. Had ordinary Catholics listened to their social teaching, the Holy See, they would have seen the direct order from the magisterium not to participate in any way in slavery because it was unjust. But Panzer writes, a commonly held view at the time was, although slavery may have been evil, to change the law would, quote, be, practically speaking, be the greater evil. Thus, we can see the practice of noncompliance with the teachings of the church as a key reason why slavery was not directly opposed by the church in the United States. The bystander today. Well, does this analogy work? Unfortunately, my own observation is perhaps the more things change, the more they remain the same. Again, as Father Panzer notes, in our own century as well, the words of Peter's successor are often rendered little more than verbal assent. Today, similarly, economics drives the bystander as much as it does the perpetrators. Research indicates from Dr. Hughes, secondary profiteers to prostitution include hotels, restaurants, taxi services, property owners who rent to businesses that support the sex industry, and the support services have a vested interest in its success. Similarly, there is an aspect, a tendency in contemporary society to view prostitution as a problem of somebody else. By way of example, if we come across an instance where a 12 or 13-year-old girl has sex with a 31-year-old man, let's say, well, we immediately call her a victim of rape. But if cash is exchanged, suddenly she has a new label, and that is the label of prostitute. Okay? Although it is true that prostitution today is illegal, and of course slavery back before the end of the Civil War was not, and that is an important distinction. Note that that does not necessarily mean that today prostitution is either impermissible or unsupported or not sanctioned. In many ways, I would submit the institution of prostitution is thriving with the support of the government. Some ways are quite direct. For example, Las Vegas profits enormously from prostitution. Prostitution, by the way, is not actually legal in the city of Las Vegas. You wouldn't know that. It's legal in some counties in Nevada. But look at how much Las Vegas itself profits from prostitution being legal, with an estimation that over 10,000 men a year come to Las Vegas for the purpose of engaging in the sex industry. Similarly, the state of Rhode Island, a largely Catholic community, for years has only banned public street-level prostitution, allowing what's referred to as indoor prostitution, prostitution between two adults that is not on the street. What's the result of that? A massive increase in, quote, massage parlors, strip clubs, and so-called spas, as well as an increase in the volume of trafficked women now converting Rhode Island as to a destination location for human trafficking. Now, recently, there was an effort in Rhode Island to change this. The Rhode Island House passed some legislation that would criminalize all prostitution and strengthen their anti-pimping laws. They were met with opposition from a rather unexpected group. That would be the Rhode Island Senate, who in their time passed their own bill, which made prostitution a non-criminal offense, so it did make it an offense, but not a criminal one, and effectively gutted the state's anti-pimping laws. Okay? Is that consistent with our social teaching? You know, the answer would be easier to take if we stood in the same position of our fellow Catholics or cousins in the 19th century. If we could somehow say, well, the teachings were ambiguous. I was sort of confused what the church said. Didn't give me clear guidance. But we're not. The church has spoken very clearly and very clearly to bystanders on this issue. The church's teaching is aimed directly at the bystander as a call to action. Case in point, in Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican II document in which the church is declared to be an agent of transformation in the modern world, we see most of the touchstones of their teaching. And I quote, "In our times, a special obligation binds us to make ourselves the neighbor of every person without exception, and of actively helping him when he comes across our path. Furthermore, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, whatever insults human dignity, such as slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, all these things are infamies indeed. They poison human society, and they are a supreme dishonor to the Creator." Well, if that were not a direct invitation enough for the bystander to embrace the needs of the slave in our midst, then the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Care of Migrants could not have been more clear in their 2005 international meeting on pastoral care for the liberation of women on the street, when they stated, "The Church invites all men and women of goodwill to commit themselves to sustaining human dignity by putting an end to sexual exploitation." So how are we doing? One could argue pretty well. We're certainly doing better than our bystanders of the 19th century because we're not like them, right? We're enlightened, okay? For starters, prostitution and commercial trafficking, sex trafficking, is illegal in the United States. And as you just told me, Professor Leary, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, in fact, labels the prostitute now a victim of human trafficking. So I'm good. I'm my sister's keeper. I live in a society that, through its criminal laws, gives her legal protection and dignity. That's a little simple, though, isn't it? It's too simple, I would suggest, to say that we're our sister's keeper because, well, gosh, we've got criminal laws against this. There are a few flaws here. First, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act still suffers from many of the negative characteristics of our past. For example, the requirement of force, fraud, and coercion means we now require an inquiry into the actions of the victim. She still is to be examined to determine if she really is a victim, to determine if she is really worthy of protection. And this harkens back to not so long ago with our treatment of rape victims and domestic violence victims, where their actions were judged more harshly than the perpetrator. Again, Dr. Hughes, the result is increased scrutiny of the women's lives, motives, and circumstances, as if they are responsible for the crimes committed against them. Although it's important to understand the supply side of trafficking, it can inadvertently become a form of victim blaming. Secondly, as we've all learned in law school, there is the law and then there's practice. And although we have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and in almost every state there are anti-pimping laws, and with a few obvious exceptions, prostitution laws, across the country, states continue to charge women with prostitution and offer John School to those who are perpetrators of the crime, because we do not want their reputations sullied. In short, while attempting to hide behind our laws to defend ourselves, if we've learned nothing after passing the 13th Amendment, we've learned that just because a law is in place, it doesn't mean that we're fulfilling our obligation to our brothers and sisters. Additionally, as many researchers have noted, the sex industry's effort to normalize prostitution as a form of labor creates a misguided and constant assault on our laws that make prostitution illegal. This is notwithstanding the fact that the research is pretty clear. In Germany, Amsterdam, Las Vegas, all demonstrate that legalizing prostitution actually does nothing for victim safety and only increases illegal prostitution and illegal trafficking, endangering far more women. For example, Melissa Farley's exhaustive study in prostitution in Nevada notes that only 10% of the prostitution that takes place is actually legal prostitution. 90% of the prostitution that takes place is indeed illegal. While it's certainly positive we have aggressive laws, it's not a sufficient defense when we balance our reality. Hundreds of thousands of women and children ultimately trafficked every year. Well, then there's always the argument, Professor Leary, I'm not a trafficker. I'm not a pimp. I am not a purchaser of sex. I am not responsible for this. I don't get any indirect benefit from this. I'd submit it's not that simple, because we are responsible for the culture in which we live. And on this point, I would suggest that not only our omissions are as egregious as our ancestors, but maybe even worse. And here I'm talking about glorification. Indeed, with regard to slavery, we do see plenty of examples of reinvention. And by that I mean we see tales, films, books where people try to tell us that slavery was really not as horrific as people say, or that type of thing, okay? The classic revisionist history, which is wrong. But we as present-day bystanders, we've arguably gone much further than that. Not only do we reinvent and recast prostitution, we glorify prostitution as modern-day slavery as something for which we should strive. Indeed, the pimp life, or life of a trafficker, also known as a slave trader, is upheld as a social positive, and the domination of women as slaves a theme of significance. If you think I'm kidding, let's go through some examples that have been documented in books like So Sexy, So Soon by Diane Levin, The Lolita Effect by Dr. Durham, the Australian Women's Forum, and great feminist scholars like Rebecca Wisnett. Video games. #1 selling video game in America, Grand Theft Auto 4. Lead character, a former human trafficker from Serbia. Rape Play, a game where it's so offensive we had to block out part of the cover. This used to be available on Amazon.com, a video game centering around a male character who stalks and rapes a mother and her 2 daughters. Amazon.com. How about other examples of this? Television and products. Think about the evolution of the word pimp as something that is good. Pimp my ride, trick my truck, or no one is too young for these messages. And then take a look at how we've used that term. You may not be able to read it, but yes, that does say, pimp your bride. Turn your girlfriend into the perfect wife in a mainstream, non-pornographic magazine. And then there are the messages specific to children. To girls, it's to commoditize themselves and perceive themselves as as only objects of pleasure and domination for others. For boys, it's to see the pimp lifestyle as something to be sought after and attained. And if you only watch Disney, you're not safe there. Here's Miley Cyrus at the Teen Choice Awards dancing around a pole over an ice cream sale, singing a song, dressed, I think it's safe to say, like a prostitute. This is a Disney star, television star, by the way, for those of you who don't know. And then let's get to music, and to be quite frank, I couldn't produce up for you any lyrics that I thought were appropriate for the Mary Mirror of Justice Awards that use the word whore and pimp. I just couldn't do it, okay? So just take my word for it that our friend 50 Cent, Snoop Dogg, and others have a lot of interesting uses of the word pimp and hoe. And of course, who can forget the Academy Award-winning song, It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp, which VH1 tells us is one of the top 100 R&B songs of all time. And how about the specific messages, as I said, to our girls? I think the images are clear, but in case it's not clear, that is a choking dog collar around the neck of Christina Aguilera. Okay? And not to forget, it is Halloween. And yes, you can not only get the pimp and prostitute costume for yourself, but for your children as well, where we learn that being a princess is out, but being a prostitute is indeed in. And I don't even have time to explore with you Vendita Carter's important work about the blatant racism and slavery themes that are in pornography, in which we see that our African American brothers and sisters are victimized in a whole other way. And if there's any doubt, there is damage to all of this. The American Psychological Association's report on the sexualization of girls defines objectification as follows: made into a thing for others' sexual use, rather than seen as a person with the capacity for independent action and decision-making. The report concludes that the negative effects of this message include damage to cognitive functioning, physical and mental health, sexuality, attitudes, and beliefs. Now, do I want a culture war? I really don't. But you know, the abolitionists probably didn't want a civil war either, okay? They just saw the need to stand up and say, this is not right. These glorifications are inaccurate, and we cannot lend support to an institution of slavery by supporting them. You know, Caritas International really hit it on the head in their 2005 document. They address many of the causes of slavery and sexual trafficking, and they note they're not limited to conditions of abject poverty and corruption in the countries of origin. Regarding the destination countries, of which the United States is a leading one, they note the increased demand on sex workers and, quote, the eroding moral norms and values of cynical consumerism in consumer-driven societies, where violence and abuse of people tend to be condoned or at least accepted as a fact of life, and are not sufficiently challenged by authorities, public opinion, educators, or the church. So what are the implications of this statement? Human trafficking is modern-day slavery? Well, I would submit it means that we live in a society that allows slavery. It means that when we walk past a victim of prostitution, and most of us at least drive past at least one every morning when we come to the Catholic University of America, we are walking past or driving past a slave. Fundamentally, it means we have to judge ourselves as harshly as we did the slave traders, owners, and bystanders of the past, which, although different in some ways, I would submit offers us reason for some concern. And I think it causes us to be concerned because the answer to the question we began with, how could people treat people like this, seems to be a combination of ignoring our own social teachings about the dignity of human beings, about economic profit and exploitation of vulnerability, and about the failure of the bystander to recognize a problem that is as pressing today as it was 250 years ago. We've made progress in our laws, but more needs to be done to have them reflect our values. We have to acknowledge that by bystanders, we must become active bystanders who will not endorse the glorification of sexual slavery. This is hard, but in the words of Sister Shodafal, the leader of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, she really couldn't have said it better in 2003 at the Vatican when she said, if we claim to be Jesus' followers, we cannot turn a blind eye, a deaf ear, or a cold shoulder to the cries of our sisters and brothers who are being abused and exploited. When any person is oppressed, we are all diminished. And when any part of creation is abused or destroyed, we all our lives are perished. So after all that, do I have hope? You know, I do. And the solution's not about passing more laws, although that would be nice. It's about a movement. It's about a social movement of abolitionists who are going to reject this kind of treatment as human beings. And I've seen this movement. I've seen this movement nationally and internationally. And its members are as varied as radical feminists and social conservatives. It's manifested in the publication of important books, such as Pornified, So Sexy, So Soon, Not for Sale, The Lolita Effect, and others. And it's a movement of individuals as well, works of people like Cordelia Anderson, Melissa Farley, Laura Lederer. And if one thinks that it does not include our community here at Catholic University of America, consider this. That boy, Daniel, he's here on campus today. He's a freshman at the Catholic University of America, embarking on his life transforming the world, hopefully to be taught by professors who will help give him guidance in that area. And his father, Kevin, is the first lay president of Covenant House, the largest homeless shelter for children in the United States, and a 1990 graduate of the Catholic University of America. And the author of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, Congressman Chris Smith, is probably one of the most prolific Catholic congressmen in the United States Congress. And it's a movement of people supporting legislation, condemning images of domination, and creating a public outcry each time the sex industry, or, and here's the harder part, one of our friends, our relatives, or coworkers does anything to minimize this as anything less than domination of another hurt person. Look, a generation from now, there's going to be another boy on another bus tour. Maybe he'll be touring Times Square. Maybe he'll be touring someplace in Nevada or Providence, Rhode Island. And he might ask his father, why do people treat people like this? Or he might ask his father, how did people treat people like this? And as to which question he will ask, that will be determined by whether or not we learn the lessons of our history and choose, and actively choose, to become our sister's keeper, or if we decide to take the already beaten path and to allow them to continue to be kept sisters. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank all of you for coming. Thank you again, Professor Leary, for being here at the Columbus School of Law and teaching all of us. We do have a reception to follow out in the atrium. I'm sure Professor Leary would be happy to talk to anybody out there about the subject. And once again, a round of applause for our Mary Mirror of Justice recipient.